At dawn, the air over Qarth was like warm silk drawn over the skin, a breath that smelled faintly of pomegranate rind, of river silt, of tar and kumquat blossoms, and the bruised green of crushed mint from gardens watered all night. From her balcony, Daenerys Targaryen watched the color come into the city, the pale plaster of domes taking on rose, then peach, then the true hard gold of day. Below, the courtyards of Xaros Hondaxos Palace were set about with shallow basins of water that caught the sky like coins. Slender boys in sheer linen hurried along the colonnades, unlocking screens of carved wood to admit the wind. Silk veils lifted and settled like breath. She stood in one of those winds with bare feet, her white hair unbound, and the three small dragons perched along the balcony's rail like gargoyles that might suddenly think better of stone. Rhaegal was first to stir, green-shadowed and lean, his ribs like a harp beneath the skin. He opened his mouth not to yawn but to taste, tongue flickering, wings hissing as they moved. Drogon, black with the red glow of coal deep under ash, studied the harbor instead, tail tapping the bronze rail so softly it made only the suggestion of a sound. Viserion lay draped over the sun-warmed marble like a cat, the ivory of his scales near invisible against the veined stone until he breathed and the heat shimmer showed his outline. Daenerys lifted her hand and all three turned, their attention like a weight upon her. They were not yet large enough to frighten the city with more than rumor, but rumor in Qarth had weight enough to bring doors open or closed. She did not mind. Some things grew best under the stare of the world. She lifted a small metal bowl of charred lamb's liver. The dragons hissed with the fragile, eager greed of children. Ser Jorah had told her to wear sandals until the paving grew accustomed to her, as if stone might be tamed by feet. He had said it smiling, but she could see the care behind the pleasantry. He did not love this city. It was too soft for him, too scented, too given to the sort of manners that always meant something other than what they said. The morning he had come home, splashed with fish blood, because a captain from the Summer Isles had insisted he step aboard to see a jar of insects that sang. She had laughed and loved him for it. The way he wore his bluntness like armor against a people who cut with silk. He came into the balcony's shade now, the lamplight from the bedchamber still in his beard. He had not slept much. He almost never slept before she did, and she had lain awake hearing the city breathe. "My queen," he said, and his eyes went automatically to the dragons before they came to her. "The 13 will meet at mid-morning. Xaro has sent a boy to say he will sponsor your entrance." "I see," Daenerys said. She gave Drogon the last shred of liver and wiped her fingers on a cloth as white and light as milk froth. The boy who had brought it pretended to be invisible, which was a kind of courtesy she liked in Qarth. She turned back to the city and the sea. Ships were standing out already in the brightening water. Low, fat rivercraft with patched sails and bowwomen painted in lapis and cinnabar. Slender hulls from beneath with dark ropes. 3 green-tiled ships flying the same black swallowtail banner that she had learned meant a bravos factor. Farther out, a boat oared in toward the eastern quay, the rower's arms rising and falling in the soft rhythm of men beginning the day's labor, not yet driven by hunger or fear. "We will go," she said. I would see the pureborn and the spicers both pretend to be moved by the same speech. Ser Jorah's mouth moved in a shape that was not quite a smile. They are rarely moved by anything but their own reckonings. "So are we all," she said, and turned to him with a lightness she did not feel, because he would have wrapped her in chainmail if she let him. "Will you have breakfast? Eerie says the kitchens have something called cloud bread." "I had fish," he said with a glum dignity that made her want to laugh again. "Breakfast," he added, because he could yield better than most soldiers when he chose, and because there was something in Qarth that insisted on softness from even the bluntest of men. The wind changed as he spoke, bringing the sour-sweet smell of ferment from the wine presses. Somewhere a slave, or a free man dressed like one. Qarth confused such things deliberately, called out for the boys and girls who sold iced milk on the street. The dragons lay down again at her feet, pleased with their meat. Drogon put his head upon her toes. His weight had grown. It was like carrying a bundle of iron bars now when she lifted him, though he could still ride on her shoulder and pretend to be small to please her. I dreamed we were flying, she said, because it felt easy to say it in this hour before the city had put on its full armor of speech. The three of you and I. We went out over the blue that is too blue to be water. And the clouds were like white mountains we slid between. And when we came to the edge of the world, the sea fell away like silk, and we fell with it, and I was not afraid. Then, that is the dream of every Targaryen, Ser Jorah said, in a voice that had no room for Qarth at all. To be high and fearless, and not to fall. I did not fall, she said. Drogon twitched in his drowse, a little flame curling from one nostril and dissipating with the ease of breath. Perhaps it is not a dream. She added, perhaps it is a memory of the blood. He looked at her with that Lannister coin steadiness of his, flicked from hand to hand for so long it had grown the smoothness of use. Perhaps, he said at last, and because the city was awake now, he added, we should be careful. They dressed her in blue to look more Qarthine, a gown cut in loops and drapes that suggested more nakedness than it revealed, glittering with seed pearls like dew. Xaro had sent the pearls and the loops. He sent gifts the way other men sent messages, full of the words he did not dare say aloud. Irri clucked over the way the sash fell. Jikwi fetched a comb with teeth so flexible they seemed like fine grass. When they had finished and Daenerys rose, the cloth's fall was like water curling from a rock, and she found she could move in it without thinking. It felt like a disguise that made her more herself. Jorah looked away when he had looked enough. A trick he had learned in her service that still betrayed him, and buckled on his sword. They went down a stair that was not a stair, a slope of marble where the polish had been worn away precisely where generations of Xaro's guests had placed their feet. Silk banners of fruit and birds stirred as they passed. By the time they stepped into the palace's forecourt, the day had fully arrived. The color of brass, the edges of things as sharp as if a sword had cut them. Xaro waited where a man in his place waited when he wanted the world to watch him wait. He wore a robe that turned from white to wine as he moved, embroidered with fish that seemed to swim in the cloth. He came forward with a slowness that suggested he was restraining an impulse to rush. When he bowed, the light found the oiled skin at his temples and his wrists, the only places the robe permitted. "My star," he said, and the words fell like a coin into a cup. "Lord Xaro," Daenerys said, and let him kiss the air above her fingers because the rings on his hands were heavy and she did not want their weight. "I have secured for you the honor of addressing the 13, he said, "and you will be given passage to the Hall of 1,000 Thrones, though you are yet to sit upon one." "You are kind," Daenerys said, and he smiled in the way that meant that this simple word had been the payment he sought. He loved appearing kind even more than he loved the coins his ships brought home. Outside the gate, the city pressed up to them in the usual manner, beautiful and dishonest, and unashamed. Qarth streets ran straight or crooked by whim, depending on whose ancestor had laid the first bricks. Sometimes they ended without warning in a pale square full of fountains that hissed like soft snakes. Sometimes they plunged downhill toward the harbor so steeply that only men with strong calves could climb back. The three walls of the city cut across the view like lines drawn for a god's amusement, each higher than the last, carved with scenes so intricate that the eye wanted to rest and then rest again. Sailors from IB rode in ox carts, as if their legs were reeds that might break. Boys ran with plated trays of candied ginger held high over their heads. Girls walked with baskets of citrus, white peels coiled around the fruit like little snakes. Daenerys saw men in long robes whose sleeves were panels of painted story, and men nearly naked, but for ropes of pearls, and women with gowns slit to the hip, and women with their faces entirely covered, and she moved among them, and was seen and not seen as she chose. They crossed a canal, the water low enough that the black scum along the walls made a ring like a thumb's print. Irri made a face. "Qarth is thirsty," she murmured in Dothraki. "Qarth has forgotten to be thirsty," Daenerys answered in the same tongue, and Irri laughed, startled into delight because she had not expected poetry. Before the Hall of 1,000 Thrones, a crowd had already gathered, so that the steps were a river of faces, and bright cloth, and polished shoulders. The guards wore lacquered breastplates that made them look like beetles. Xaro's name was a key that turned in the lock. They were admitted through a side entrance cool and shaded with blue wood, and into a chamber so large it seemed a piece of the sky had been brought down and shaped into a roof. The 1,000 thrones were an invention and an exaggeration both. Daenerys counted 100, or perhaps a little more, arranged on tiers. Some were ivory carved like foam, some of hammered bronze, some built cunningly of glass rods that made the sitters seem to float. The 13 sat like men who had expected to be emperors and found they were kings in the meantime. The ancient guild of spicers sat as if the only true thrones were double-bottomed chests of coin. The pureborn wore their ancestry like perfume that must be reapplied each hour or it faded. She spoke to them as she had taught herself to speak to men who had chosen a hard world and softened it to their liking. She told them who she was without apology and without insistence, as if no one's belief or disbelief mattered to the truth. She told them what she desired without making a demand. She desired ships. She desired grain. She desired coin to pay the men who would sail the ships and load the grain and strike the coin should the mint balk. In return, she offered a future that tasted like myth and iron both. She did not speak long because she had learned that in Qarth, the longest speech was the one made by silence after it. They were pleased with her for different reasons. Some saw in her a story that would bring people to their doors. Some saw a way to sell cloth and spice and skilled hands to whatever the West became when it had eaten its fill of fire. Some saw only her dragons, and they were not pleased at all. "You ask much," said Malako of the ancient guild of spicers, whose eyelids were painted with saffron, so that he appeared always on the verge of tears. "But the city is not a purse to be turned out into the hand of every beggar with a song." "I did not sing," Daenerys said, and the laughter that rose was not quite laughter. "Nor did I beg." An old pureborn with hands too white for a man existed in Qarth in order to say the thing that made everyone else feel young. "Bloodlines are stories kings tell their bastards," he murmured, not quite addressing her, but letting his voice carry. Ser Jorah shifted beside her. Xaro put up a hand that said he was her man as long as all could see it. Daenerys dragons lay along the arms of her chair like ornaments, still and watchful as cats. She told them that her father had sat a throne, and his father before him, and his father before him, and that men had called her father mad and her brother worse. She did not flinch from the words because they would find her no matter how many doors she closed. She told them that she did not mean to repeat what had been done to burn her house down, that what she wanted was not to watch the world burn for the beauty of the flame. She told them of her people lost and scattered and enslaved and dead. She spoke of promises not kept and debts not paid and oaths made in the dark. Then she asked for ships again and made no offer of her dragons. She would have sold her crown. She would never sell heat and breath and bone. When she had finished, the spicer's eyes had widened in admiration at the neatness of her balance, and the pureborn had narrowed their eyes to slits small as the mouths of jars. The 13 were the 13. They smiled the way men smile who are always measuring whether the hand that holds the knife might yet be their friend. "You will dine with me tonight," Xaro said, into the hush that followed, and the quiet he drew around his words was smooth as silk. "I have invited only those who can give you ships, and the poet whose voice makes men forget to eat." "I will dine with you," Daenerys said, and rose, and felt the weight of eyes shift with her. They walked out the way they had entered, through the blue light door. The crowd outside seemed to have thinned, though she did not remember it doing so. When they reached the steps, a boy stepped from the throng and thrust up a shallow bowl, carved of nut-brown wood. An offering, she thought. A child's dulled coin of devotion. In the bowl lay a thing like a jewel, faceted and dark, which moved. Ser Jorah saw it a breath before she did. His hand caught her arm and flung it back with more force than he would have used on a man. The bowl fell and broke. The thing in it dropped to the stone and unfolded claws and legs, with a dry whisper like paper being torn. In the moment before Jorah's boot came down and crushed it, Daenerys saw many eyes and a darting sting like a needle made of malice. The crowd made a sound with no word in it. Then its voice fractured into 100 explanations. A masked woman stepped forward, one of the Shadowbinders from the east, her eyes the only flesh visible through lacquered wood. She lifted a gloved hand and pointed, not at the boy, who was already running, but at the higher tiers of steps where two men stood very still, as if the noise did not apply to them. Their robes were a storm night. Their lips were blue with the dye that told the city that they had drunk something they had not quite returned from. Warlocks. Ser Jorah said softly, and the word made the hair on Daenerys' arms stir. Quaithy's voice came as if from a distance, though she stood a few paces away. Those who have been dead a little do not bear being mocked. She said gently, and the eyes behind her mask turned toward the smashed thing on the stones. Be careful, child of smoke. Daenerys had grown weary of being called child by those who did not love her. I am careful, she said, and I am not a child. She set her hand on Drogon's back. His skin felt like warm stone. Her fingers found the subtle flecks of muscle beneath. The warlocks had not moved. The line of their shoulders was not arrogance exactly. It was the steadiness of men who carried a grudge like a full cup they would never spill. They left the steps before the city could speak the story into something that would cling to her. In the street, a breeze came like a hand to her cheek, and then moved on. Jorah walked too close. Xaro walked too far, as if to show that nothing could stain him. Daenerys felt a part of herself narrow to a point and go bright. Quaithe fell in behind them, noiseless as a veil. You will not go again to the house of the undying, Ser Jorah said, as if he could forbid it and make the world obey. I have no wish to return to a place that shows 1,000 faces and none of them true, said Daenerys. Then, because she had learned that truth sometimes needed to be wrapped, so men would not try to warm their hands at it. There are other houses in Qarth, none where you will be safe, he muttered. No, she said, but are houses where I will be seen. They reached Xaro's palace and left the street behind like a language they had grown tired of speaking. In the cool shade of the colonnade, boys were treading flowers into a syrup that smelled of grief so sweet, it became joy. Daenerys allowed herself to be undressed and then redressed, like a child or a queen. She allowed herself to be fed with spoons of sugared water and spoons of salted soup, so that her body would remember it. It was a thing in the world, a vessel that needed filling. The dragons drowsed in the highest of the windows, turning the sun to a rind of gold around each scale. When dusk came, it came like wine poured carefully, staining first the edges of things and then their hearts. The dinner Xaro had promised unfurled in the long hall, where the floor was a map of the city made entirely of polished stones, a canal done in serpentine, a gate in a black marble that took light into itself and gave none back. The poet's voice was as promised, a reed bent almost to breaking but never quite, and men and women leaned forward to drink from it. Daenerys sat at the head of the table beside Xaro because she could not sit lower without making a statement she did not intend. Ser Jorah stood behind her and to the left, as if he could be both shadow and shield. They came, the men with ships. One had hands scarred by rope burns from a youth too proud to give orders he could not also obey. One had polished him into rotund perfection and wore a ring in each ear in the shape of a small silver fish. A woman from Eniath sat near the end, listening more than speaking, her black hair pinned with 3 pins of tortoiseshell. A sailor from IB ate with the tidy greed of a man who had made hunger his friend. They asked questions like nets, and she slipped through, leaving on each a little something to be pleased with. Yes, she would consider a lease on cargo space in return for immediate payment. Yes, she would guarantee a certain market for jade and silk if those ships returned full of rye. No, she would not part with any of the dragons, nor their eggs, nor a single scale. Perhaps we speak not of parting but of sharing, said the Braavosi with the swallowtail banners, smiling with his eyes as if the smile were a secret he offered only to her. A partnership, sweet queen. You will own the legend, we will own the work. Menatan Shah. I do not share my blood. She said pleasantly, and he accepted the rebuff with better grace than most men would have done. Around them dishes came and went with the precision of a well-drilled phalanx. Goose in kumquat sauce, base with herbs. A dish of thin noodles dressed with oil and mint and flecks of the red pepper that made Xaro dab delicately at his eyes and declare it his favorite. The poet sang of a city drowned and the fishes who remembered they had once been men. Between courses, Qarth drifted to the edge of the lamplight, her mask like a drowned moon. She did not sit or speak. When Daenerys looked at her, the Shadowbinder inclined her head the way a woman might do when seeing another reflected in a mirror she herself held. When the dinner was over, and the poet had put away his voice like a blade, and the guests had either secured what they hoped for or decided to let the future do the work, Xaro walked with Daenerys in the garden. Qarth's gardens were not northern things, nor even like the gardens of Pentos. They were long, narrow places between walls, where the night wind came more quickly and stayed longer, and pools lay like pages, and the fruit smelled like a promise kept too late. He took her hand in that way of his that felt not like a lover's touch, but like a man taking possession of a jewel in order to admire it. She did not pull away. She let the darkness make their faces plain. "You see," he said, "how easily the world gathers for you when I ask it to. I see how the world gathers for itself." She said, "And that you have a gift for making it look like it does so for me." He laughed, genuinely pleased. "Come, come, you wound me. I ask only to be permitted to be the first to do you a service. You have been doing me services since the day I entered your city." She said, "I do not forget." He stopped beside a basin ringed with glass lilies that made a soft sound when the breeze touched them. "Then do not forget this. There are many in Qarth who would prefer to keep you precisely as you are now. Beautiful, remarkable, harmless. Do you understand? They will make of you a festival. They will write you into their songs and call it love. They will dress your dragons in gold chains and call it honor." He looked down at the water. Her reflection lay in it like a coin on a dark table. "Marry me," he said conversationally, as if discussing the weather. "Let me become the door you walk through, and all the rooms beyond will open. I have been a door for other men." She said, and he winced, a touch of honest hurt among all his lacquered gestures. "I will not be one for you. My heart breaks," Xaro said and smiled. "But even broken hearts do business. Let us at least behave like men and women who understand that love and trade are the same thing said at different tables." Let us behave," she said, and left him with his basin and his lilies. In bed that night, Daenerys lay on the cool cotton and watched the room fill with the blue of late moon. The dragons had taken to sleeping above her, not together like kittens, but each in his own chosen high place, as if even in rest they were learning how to watch different directions. She could hear Jorah in the next room, not sleeping. She could hear the city beyond, which did not sleep at all. In the thin hour when sleep almost took her, she thought again of the boy with the ball, and of the warlocks. She did not fear them, not exactly. She feared what they loved. Men who loved death could not be bought with any of the coins she had learned to spend. She woke before true dawn, when the world felt not yet decided. The dragons stirred to her, as if to a new wind. She dressed herself and told Irri to sleep, and took no escort but Jorah and a Qarthine guide who knew how to move quickly through a city that prized slowness as a virtue. They went to the markets by the water, where the first boats unloaded bread as crusted as old armor, and the last drunkards of the night fell into the net of day. She had learned the smell of good grain. She had learned the look of honest salt. She bought both. Men stared at her and did not shout, as they would have done in the streets of Pentos. In Qarth people wore their astonishment like a fine garment, and dared not wrinkle it. A woman with 3 children and no husband touched the hem of her gown, not to dirty it, but to prove something to herself. Daenerys looked down and saw the particular tiredness that was not age, and was older than it. She had not come out to be a saint, but being seen was a kind of duty when one had chosen to be seen. She bent and spoke to the children in the low voice she had learned to use with the dragons. Their eyes widened as if the day had grown larger. She gave the mother a small stamped coin from the purse at her belt. Xaro's purse. Xaro's coin. She would use what she must until she could mint her own. The woman's hands trembled at the weight of it. Jorah watched with the look that meant he was both pleased and worried. The Qarthine guide looked away, as if to see what was not his business. At midday, they returned through a quarter where the dye workers lived. Cloth hung from rods stretched between buildings, purple and orange, and a blue so deep it swallowed you. The people who lived there were touches of the colors they made. A finger stained, a lock of hair too bright. Daenerys asked to stop and bought bolts of cloth lighter than water, to be made into garments for her people, and a length of simple linen to cover a man's head in hard sun. She bought more than she needed. She had discovered that in Qarth buying too little was like speaking too softly. No one believed you had anything to say. The days began to fall into a pattern, as days will even when the heart is a storm. In the mornings she met merchants, shipmasters, the clever, the ugly, the greedy, the merely curious, and learned how to stand so that her height, she was not tall, seemed like a posture she had chosen rather than a thing given or denied. At midday she went out with Jorah on some small errand that reminded her she was not only a story but a person with feet that grew hot and tired. In the afternoons, she sparred with the 13 and the Spicers and the Pureborn, separately or together. Their words knives, her words silk that could cut, if drawn the right way. When the heat lay on the city like a press of hands, she went up to the highest balconies with her dragons and let the wind take some of it away. Irri fanned her with palm leaves that smelled like their own kind of sea. Jogo came back at last with the remnants of her khalasar, and the returned men stood in the courtyard like trees that had learned to live in a new ground. They wore Qarthine silk with Dothraki knives. They taught the palace guards a game played with bones and predictions. When the moon was thin and the water sounded loud, Qarth came and stood in the doorway without crossing it, and said her careful little warnings that were not warnings, so much as descriptions of the paths that lay underfoot. "You think the city is a market," Qarth said one night, and moonlight caught the edge of her mask so that it gleamed like a scaled thing. "It is a desert. Men die of thirst in both." "I am learning to drink," Daenerys said. "They will teach you to like the taste of sand," said Qarth, and went away. One evening, a letter arrived from Illyrio Mopatis, heavy with the scent of the oil he used to keep moths from his papers, and full of assurances that ships could be had, and men too, if only she would come north to Pentos, and from there to Volantis, and thence to... He had a way of making the road feel shorter by listing many steps. She read it, and tasted the sweetness of certainty, and the rancidness underneath. Illyrio's certainty was only ever certainty about what he could count. She wrote back a polite note, thanking him for his interest, telling him that she was safe, and that the world had not ceased in her absence. She sealed it and sent it with a boy whose skin shone with oil. When the seal broke in a Braavosi factor's office a day later, Illyrio would be told what she wished him to know: that she had chosen, for now, to stay in Qarth. Staying was its own war. Some mornings she woke with the dreadful desire to move, to tear the pattern, to make the horizon change. Hers was a blood bred for the road and the sky. But the dragons ate and slept and fought one another in practice, with the delightful ferocity of creatures whose bodies were constantly being remade. Their wings grew, their bones hardened, their teeth scaled up like a song learning new notes. They needed time. She had learned that love for them felt like fear sometimes, the fear of all the ways she might fail them simply by asking too much too soon. In Qarth, they might grow without needing to be used. One afternoon, she walked with Ser Jorah along the middle wall, which told the history of the city in relief. Ships as long as snakes. Men throwing down ropes to save drowning men or perhaps to bind them. Women in gowns like water holding up balls of fruit that looked like offering and gluttony both. The stone had been polished by hands and wind. It tasted of sun. Jorah reached out and traced the line of a carved oar with his fingers. "Would you wish to return to Bear Island?" she asked him suddenly. The question had come to her as she watched him there. A broad-shadowed man made smaller by a city that never asked its men to lift anything heavier than a wine jar. If I asked you to go and hold it for me, would you go? He looked at her, and his face moved in a dozen small ways. None of them the way it moved in battle. If you asked me to go to the bottom of the sea and hold a rock there for a year, I would try, he said. His mouth twitched. And drown. I would not ask you to drown. She said, and he smiled. And for a long time they said nothing because there was nothing to be added to that. That night, a fire appeared on the sky's edge, not a star but a smear that blinked and grew. The city tasted it on the wind and began to speak. Sorrow came to her balcony in a robe the color of storms and said, "A ship," as if she could not see it, because he wished the words to be his. A ship burning, out beyond the last of the markers, where the water deepened, and the seabed gave way to places that men did not speak of. It burned without moving, and then it moved, and then it was gone. Later, sailors swore that when it vanished, the water did not close, but hung for a time like glass. The warlocks of Qarth smiled with the small coin of their mouths, and said, "It had always been so." Qarth said nothing. Daenerys watched and said nothing, and her dragons, stirred by the strangeness, climbed to the highest balcony, and beat their wings and cried, and she felt the sound in her bones like a bell. Word came then from the warlocks. A poem sent as a letter sent as a threat. The house of the Undying had been damaged, they said. Not by fire but by insult, and insult was worse. She had gone where she was not invited. She had taken what she had not paid for. A vision, a piece of the city's old dreaming. They demanded recompense. If she did not give it, they would take it. It was curious to Daenerys that men who loved death spoke in such carefully legal ways. She wrote a line back. "My recompense is the air you have breathed since I arrived." She did not send it. She burned it over a lamp and fed the ash to Drogon, and laughed at herself for the childishness, and felt better. There was a night then when sleep did not come, and when it came, it was full of narrow rooms with no doors, and the smell of old spices crushed underfoot, and a sound like many tongues speaking at once, and none of them speaking to her. She woke with a headache that lay across her eyes like a band. She walked out onto the balcony and found Qarth there, not in the doorway this time, but in the full of the night, mask in her hand. Without it, she was a woman with a mouth that had learned to keep secrets without being embittered by them. "Your city makes me strange," Daenerys said, because in the night such things could be said as if they were observations about the weather. "It is not my city," Qarth said. "It is your mirror. If you do not like what you see, you may choose another glass." "I will choose this one a while longer," Daenerys said, and the Shadowbinder inclined her head, as if a queen had issued a sentence. By the next morning, the story of the burning ship had turned into 5 stories, and by the evening into 15. She was being blamed and credited in equal measure. Men came to her wanting protection from things that had not happened. Women came to her wanting blessing for things they intended to do. A boy who had stood in the heat of the marketplace all day holding a spray of citrus blossoms for the woman he wished to make his wife pressed them on Daenerys, instead when the woman would not see him. Daenerys, on a whim she did not fully understand, called the woman to her and stood them together, the boy swallowing his fear as if it were too large a syrupy sweet, the girl's mouth a line made of stubbornness. "He is foolish," Daenerys said to the girl, "and brave. You are wise and afraid. You will make a good pair." The girl began to smile then in spite of herself. Later, Jorah chided her gently for meddling, and she laughed and told him she was practicing queening in a safe city where the consequences would be small. The consequences proved not as small as she hoped. The boy's brother belonged to a gang that stole fruit and sold it at a profit under a false banner that pretended they were doing charity. They did not like being deprived of a neat marriage that would have brought them influence in a corner of the city, where influence was measured by who had the key to which gate. There was a knife in an alley. Jorah took it. His arm bled. The boy lived. Daenerys learned that even gifts had to be weighed before they were given. The warlocks tried again, not with poison but with smoke. A veil of it drifted through the palace at noon, though no brazier smoked and no oil burned. It smelled faintly of almond. Its touch left the skin cold where the air was hot. The dragons sneezed and sneezed, small explosions of fire that singed the hangings and sent servants crawling on their bellies with wet cloths. For a moment, Daenerys thought she saw, inside the smoke, a road running under a mountain of ice, and on that road, a man whose hair was white as hers, walking away. She stood very still until the smoke went out of the windows, like a creature who had made a mistake and wished to leave without apology. The dragons came down and lay along her legs as if she were the only warm thing left. That night, she told Xaro that if the smoke came again, she would set the upper rooms of his palace alight as a precaution. He laughed too loudly, and then not at all. She began quietly to build a guard of her own. Not men in livery who would be taken for her servants and bribed accordingly, but men and women whose loyalty would not be guessed at by those who counted loyalty in coin alone. She hired a pair of sisters who had worked as scribes in the city's registers and could copy any hand without being discovered. She hired a man from Tyrosh who limped and so was believed to be harmless, and a Qarthine widow whose husband had been a sailor and who had learned to hear the wind in a voice. She dressed none of them in her colors and taught them to smile at nothing. She told them to listen first to the quiet difference in footsteps that meant someone had decided to do harm, and then to the words that dressed the decision up. Ser Jorah frowned, but he came to see the sense in it as her little guard began to bring her news before the city could turn it into rumor. They told her which gates were being paid to open after midnight, and which warehouses smelled of pepper when no pepper had come into the port for a week. They told her of a meeting in a chamber where the floor was an inlaid map of the world, and the men there spoke as if they could push armies around like little wooden dogs. They told her who had bought a new ring in the shape of a small blue tongue. She listened and made no sudden movements, as if she were trying to coax a shy bird to feed from her hand. On a day when the wind came from the southwest and carried a taste of wet iron, she rode out with Jogo and Jorah to the western gate. Beyond it lay a country of salt pans and scrub that went away into a shimmer, and, if you rode long enough, into something that men took care not to name. The dragons came with her, not flying but leaping from shoulder to shoulder like crows along a fence until they found a ruined arch in the sun and lay upon it. She wanted to see what the world looked like without walls. It looked like a thought that no one had yet finished thinking. She sat and let the sun mark her shoulders with the faintest of colors, and felt for a time as if she were a girl who had not yet become a mirror for anyone else. Jogo found a snake under a stone and killed it with a neat flick of his wrist, and laughed because it was small. They are always small near the city, he said. They grow larger where men do not look. Ser Jorah said. He said it idly, and then saw her looking at him and colored, as much as his skin and beard would permit. I speak nonsense, he added, in the manner of a man correcting a horse too hard. You speak truth, Daenerys said, and thought of a different kind of snake with blue lips and a house full of dead men, and stood. The storm came at dusk, riding in on a line of violet that drew the sun down like a curtain. The city praised the rain with open jars and open mouths, and a little lewdness, because they believed it pleased the sky to be treated as a lover. The scent of dust lifting was so intoxicating Daenerys almost laughed aloud. She stood in the courtyard and let the rain beat her shoulders. The dragons loved it. They opened their mouths and tasted it, each drop in astonishment. Irri cried and said it tasted of home and not home both. Jorah stood under the colonnade and watched her with an expression that looked like prayer and disapproval, measured out in even parts. After the rain, the city's colors were a deeper, stranger set of colors, as if they had been kept hidden and then let out. In that cleanness, the warlocks tried again. This time they sent a singer whose voice had the peculiar quality of making men forget where they were. He came to the palace gates and sang the same song the poet had sung at Xaro's dinner, and cast only that smallest of spells. A memory reshaped. Those who heard it saw again the burning ship, saw it with the particular heat of that first sight, which had grown in the telling into something almost erotic and almost holy. The singer's lips were blue. He did not try to pass the gate. He wanted only to wrap the palace in a veil of sameness and make the rooms inside not quite rooms. Daenerys listened from a balcony until the spell had almost taken, then told Irri to dance, and told the boys in the kitchen to drop a basket of pots, and told Jogo to laugh as loudly as he could, and in those noises, the spell tore like thin cloth. She sent no answer to the warlocks. She made no move against them. They had the patience of men who had nothing else to do. She had no such patience. She had learned that sometimes the cleverest war was the one not fought at all, at least for a time. Summer moved along the bones of the city. The dragons shed scales and found them again bigger. Qarth's merchants learned which of her moods meant they could press, and which meant they must be content with what she gave. The pureborn refused her in 5 different elegant ways that each tasted of the same refusal. The spicers began to believe that coin might be minted from hope if your ledgers were bold enough. Xaro told her 100 times in 100 robes that he loved her and would go on loving her whether or not she wished it. She smiled at him and told him once that if he loved her, he should love also the part of her that did not love him, and he went away and returned with a heavier ring of pearls. Then there arrived a ship from the Basilisk Isles, smelling of wood smoke and a kind of rot she could not place. Its captain came to see her with a swagger that felt like a man balancing on a narrow plank. He had brought no cargo. He had brought stories. In those stories, a man with a patch over one eye had taken to the sea again with a lean crew of boys barely old enough to be men, and they were working between small ports in the Far East, taking first a little of what men would give, then the rest. The man's name was Ur. No one agreed on it. Some said it like a wave, some like a caw. He had a certain way of looking at the horizon that made those who saw him look too, as if something might be coming that would require their full hearts. Daenerys listened and found herself smiling because she heard in the story a kinship, a restlessness. When she asked what banner the man flew, the captain grinned and said, "None that I could see, but his ship carried a storm with it." And she felt her smile leave her mouth and go somewhere private to be considered. When the captain had gone, Ser Jorah said, "There is always a man like that on the sea." "And a woman like me on the shore," Daenerys said. And they looked at one another as if both had said something and refused to explain it. One morning at last there came to her a white-bearded man who walked with a staff, and a very large brown man who wore nothing but a belt and pride. They were announced as a pair of entertainers, which was a new word for bodyguard. The white-bearded man bowed with the exact measure of humility that made kings suspicious, and then lifted his head with the exact measure of confidence that made them give him work. The big man bowed not at all but slapped his belly and laughed. "Strong Belwaz," he said in a voice like a drum. "Eats much, fights more. And you?" Daenerys said to the old man who had yet to give his name. "I am called Arstan," he said. "I know something of ships and a little of kings." His eyes, which were very clear, met hers and went away and returned in a way that suggested he was a man who liked to be certain that he had seen what he thought he had. "Ships are useful," Daenerys said. "Ace are men who have known kings and yet can still look a girl in the face." Arstan smiled in a way that made it possible to imagine a younger face under the beard. "It is men who cannot look a girl in the face who are not to be trusted," he said. She did not ask at once who had sent them. In Qarth, it was often wiser to see what men did when their names were not called upon. She asked instead whether they liked the city. Arstan looked at the walls not as decoration, but as writing. "It is made of memory," he said. "Memories need to be walked now and then lest they stiffen." "Strong Belwaz likes the food," said Strong Belwaz, who had startled a spider crab at the gate with a noise and then eaten it raw for the pleasure of the guard, who had tried to forbid it. Daenerys found herself glad of both. It pleased her to think of a very large man who would break the wrist of a warlock with indifferent ease, and a very old man who might advise her on when to hold her speech, and when to let it go ahead without her. She assigned them rooms and told Irri to find them cool water and jiggui, to see that they were fed. She thought, as she watched Arstan walk away, that his back had known armor and that he had unlearned it just enough to pass for a courtier. She thought as she watched strong Belwas squat with relish over a bowl of honeyed figs, that he would be the sort of friend who could be asked to be rude when politeness had failed. That evening Qarth came again and stood in the moonlight. She wore her mask, but held it in her hands as if it were a baby. And her voice came through it as if through a shell. "You have chosen to stay," she said, as if reporting the weather. "Now you must choose the manner of staying." "I have chosen the manner," Daenerys said, perhaps more quickly than the truth allowed. "I will make of this city a place where my dragons can grow without being stolen, where men will learn to speak their names with a kind of fear that is not hatred. I will gather ships the way a tree gathers birds. I will plant my people in the cracks and crevices and water them with coin and honor and a little of my attention, and they will hold fast until I am ready." Qarth was silent for a time that felt like water sliding down a glass. "And when you are ready?" she asked. "I will go west," Daenerys said, and the word west felt like the taste of something she had not eaten for too long. And she held it in her mouth a moment longer than she needed. "Do not let the city teach you to forget that," Qarth said. "It will try. It will call itself the world." Daenerys looked out at the lights that marched the harbor's edge, and the black beyond where the sea waited, and held her tongue. Behind her she felt the slow weight of Drogon uncurl from the beam where he had slept, and drop to the bed with a thump. He came to her, stretching his neck to find that place just below her collarbone where he liked to lay his head. He breathed, and she felt his breath, and it was warmer than the night. In the days that followed, the city tested her with the stubbornness of a child who wants to know whether the limits named are truly limits. The ancient guild of spicers offered a contract that would have made her the nominal owner of 10 ships, and left her, in fact, the debtor of 100 men she had never met. She declined politely and offered instead to buy the ships outright for a price that made them laugh, and a schedule of payments that made them stop laughing. The 13 proposed a pageant to display her dragons to the people, safety assured, of course, by guards whose loyalty could be purchased by anyone prepared to outbid the 13. She smiled and asked instead for a procession of orphans and widows, of the sick and the maimed, to be fed at the city's expense while her dragons watched from the walls. The pureborn sent a poet to praise her in a fashion that made her blood seem a kind of perfume. She thanked the poet and gave him a purse, and invited him to praise also the women who washed the city's clothes along the canals, which produced verses so sincere the pureborn withdrew their patronage. The warlocks, having failed at smoke and song, tried hunger. Men who brought her grain found their boats mysteriously unloaded, and their grain redistributed to other stalls, and their money returned to them in counterfeit coins so excellent it was accepted at 3 shops before being detected. She sent strong Belwas to smile at men in the markets and ask loudly where he might buy more of this clever counterfeit, and the warlocks discovered that mischief is less pleasing when it struts in the sun wearing a naked sword. There were moments when she grew tired, bone-tired, the kind that sleep could not address. In those moments she took Drogon into her arms and walked with him along the highest walkways where the city fell away on every side, and the sky was so close it seemed to rest on her hair. She told him stories of her brother Rhaegar, of a man she had never met, and yet loved in the way a girl loves a song. She told him of her mother, of nothing much, because she knew almost nothing, and so she made up what mothers were like and gave that to herself as if she had been given it already. She told him of Viserys and did not flinch. She told him of a house with a red door, and of a lemon tree, and of a woman's laugh she had never identified and found herself thinking had perhaps been her own. And when the first ship that was truly hers came into the harbor, its sails patched, but its hull sound, its captain a man who had learned to listen before he spoke. She did not weep, as she had imagined she might. She stood and watched it tie up, and then walked toward her with its new name painted on its side in letters that were both Qarthine and Valyrian. The name was Hope in one tongue and Patience in the other. The captain bowed and offered her the key to the hold as if offering her a dowry. She took it and felt its roughness. It was a small thing. She loved it, She sent the ship out 3 days later with a hold full of unsalted fish and bone-white salt, and 2 barrels of honey. And when it returned with grain and steel and a Bolivian— No, she corrected herself. There were no Bolivians in the world she knew, with a low-domed clay oven from the Far East that would bake bread slowly and make the courtyard smell like certainty. She allowed herself one small sup. It sounded like a girl, and no one heard it but Jorah, who looked away and let it be. Summer ran on. The city's water ran low, and then filled, and then ran low again. The dragons learned the names of winds. Arstan told her stories of a Westeros that sounded like a tale where the ending had been lost and the middle gone wandering. He spoke of a boy who had been a king without knowing the price of it, and a man who had been a knight without knowing the use of it, and a woman who had been a queen who had known both and chosen neither. He did not say the names. She did not ask. She learned more in his silences than in the thickest of the Spicer's letters. And all the while the warlocks were not still. Men began to see things in mirrors that did not trouble them, because they were pleasing. Themselves, 15 years younger. Women they had loved, unbetraying. The city liked such sorcery better than poison. It liked to be reassured. Daenerys sent quietly for glass that did not reflect at all, and had it placed in certain alleys. Men shy of what they might see walked a little faster there, and the spell turned thin. On a night when the moon sat very low and looked like something she could lift, she climbed the inner wall with Arstan and Jorah and strong Belwas, the latter cursing cheerfully at the steps, because he claimed walking up was an insult to a man's legs. The harbor lay below them like a creature at rest, its breath a small slap of water against piers. Far out, a single flame moved in a way that was not like a ship. She did not point it out. They all saw it. They stood and watched until it went down. The air smelled of metal. A coolness moved across her skin, and the dragons shifted above her in the darkness, as if in answer to something too large for words. Staying is not the same as waiting, she said then. Aloud or to herself she could not tell. No, Arstan said gently. It is choosing your ground. She put her hand on the stone. It was warm still from the day, though the night had had its will of it for hours. She thought of the grain in her warehouses, of the sails unfurling with her sigil stitched in thread that had not seen battle, of the boys rolling jars of water to the poorest quarters, because she had said it would be so, and Zero had found a way to make it profitable enough that men did not complain. She thought of the dragons sleeping, and of the city that had decided to become her cage or her crucible, and could not yet tell which it would be. She felt the old impatience rise in her and then go down again, like a tide that had seen a moon and obeyed it. Below, a bell rang, one of the small ones that did not carry to the whole city, but told a certain street that night had begun, and they were forgiven for the things they would do until morning. Daenerys breathed in and out, and counted not the days until she would sail, but the days she had made hers in the place she had chosen. Somewhere in the darkness, a boy told a girl a story about a queen with 3 dragons, who had turned a city of silk into a city that could endure. Somewhere else, a man lay awake and planned how to steal one of those dragons and sell it to a king who believed in a kind of power that could be bought. On the highest balcony, Drogon opened one eye and saw the piece of sky he considered his, and closed it again, satisfied. When dawn came, it came as it always did, not because of anything she had done, yet because of everything. The light slid its thin blade between the stacked roofs and rested at last upon her hands where they lay on the stone. She lifted them and looked at them and thought. For a moment, of ash under her nails and of blood in the lifeline, and felt neither shame nor hunger for it, only a quiet readiness. She turned her face to the sea. The ships in the harbor rocked a little, as if agreeing between themselves to something she had not yet said. The city behind her inhaled once, like a beast sleeping. She smiled a little, a smile she had learned in Qarth. Not yet, she told the wind, and the wind carried the words away without question. She could make it bring them back when she wished. For now she had chosen to stand precisely where she was, with her dragons warm and growing and the city's many mirrors around her, and her name held carefully in 100 different mouths. She would not be kept or caged. She would not be hurried. She had at last made Qarth part of her road rather than a place where the road ended. And on that road, beneath the sweetness of spices and the oily shine of courtesies, she could taste iron. It was not unpleasant. It tasted like the future, and she swallowed it without flinching. Okay. Me. The days that followed were written in amber and salt. Heat scraped the horizon bright as a whetstone, and the city behaved as if it had been promised forever. At sunrise, Daenerys took her seat beneath a carved lintel where fish and fruit played at being gods, and let the city flow to her like a slow river, petitioners waiting one by one and holding up their little boats. The first came with a dispute about water rights in a lane barely wider than a man's shoulders. Two households whose wells touched in the earth below, and had learned to hate one another more efficiently than they learned to share. She listened, asked questions cool as poured milk, and made the ground itself her ally. She ordered the wellhead rebuilt and the stones reseated, so the water would rise true to the center. They bowed, wrong-footed by a judgment that gave neither victory nor defeat. They would go back to their lane and tell themselves how they had won. The second petitioner brought a boy with ink-stained fingers and a ledger filled neat as a woven mat. He asked for a license to sell snow scraped from the cold rooms of the rich to men who worked in the dye quarter. Daenerys turned his ledger and saw where his columns had been laid to catch a good man's greed and not a bad one's, and she granted his license and taxed it half a year hence. The third brought a young woman whose hair was cut to the neck like a widow's, but who wore no veil. She had been accused of stealing figs. She had stolen work. Daenerys gave her a place in the palace kitchens, where the ovens were hungry and the women fierce, and the figs, when there were figs, were counted by the bossy finger of a girl who had learned that power could be wielded without cruelty. When the supplicants thinned to what the Qartheen considered a comfortable trickle, she rose and put away her crown. That is, she slid the light chain of hammered copper around the pillar and left it to rest there, a snake that did not bite, and took her dragons to the galleries where the wind lived. Rhaegal used the balustrade as a leap and the sky as a net. Viserion discovered the trick of folding his wings at the lowest possible instant and falling like a dropped knife before flaring to catch himself with a flush of pride. Drogon tasted the wind with his mouth slightly ajar like a boy tasting the first story he has ever truly believed. She sent bits of charred goat high into the air and called their names until the call and the catch became a dance that felt like the edge of prayer. It was there, her hair blown back and coins of sunlight playing across her arms, that Xaro came with a letter held between two fingers, as if it might stain him. He had dressed himself in sea colors that morning, a robe of pale and deeper blue, embroidered with sprays of white thread, that could be read as foam or as blossoms. The letter was sealed in black wax, and smelled of something medicinal and faintly sweet. From a factor of Astapor, he said, with the blandness of a man pretending to have no opinion. The Red City sends its regards and an offer. The word Astapor uncoiled in her like a remembered fever. She had weighed that road, the one lined with stone men whose faces had been eaten by salt and wind. She had turned her horse's head away from it and brought her people into Qarth and eaten smoke. If Astapor thought to come to her, it had as much right as any slaver to ply his goods at a great port. Daenerys broke the seal. The hand that had formed the characters was a proud one, precise without fuss. Like a man who had learned to write under a lash, and sworn he would never let the lash show. The factor wrote of unsullied as a baker might write of fine flour. The evenness of it, the way it took water, the bread it made. He offered to bring a cohort by ship for her inspection. 50, perhaps 100 gelded spears to prove their quality. Payment in coin or in dragons. She read the page twice and let it fall to her lap. Drogon stretched his neck across the parchment's edge as if to claim it. His nostril made a small dark circle of moisture on the ink. Say what you will say, she told Xaro without looking up. She had learned to let men roll their arguments like bright beads in their fingers before she chose to take or scatter them. He arranged his face into concern with a twinkle. My star, This is the world coming at last to sit correctly. You need soldiers. Soldiers in Qarth are expensive and often owe their true loyalty to someone's aunt. The Unsullied are an excellent fiction that has the advantage of being true. Obedience without pride. You might make of this city whatever you wish with 100 at your back. They are slaves, she said. Her voice did not lift. She had learned to speak that word in Qarth as one might say rain. A fact, neither blessing nor curse on its face, yet a thing upon which everything depended. He spread his hands to declare his helplessness in the face of reality. Slaves nonetheless who will die to name you queen. One must begin with what is available, or one may choose to make new things, she said. He laughed, not unkindly. Making new things is a fashion in Qarth. It is rarer to succeed at it. He glanced to the dragons and counted without appearing to count. If you will not let them have the towers, you must build the ground. When he had gone, she sent for Ser Jorah and for Arstan, and she had strong Belwas fetched too, because what one loved could sometimes be seen best when a fool laughed at it. They came and she put the letter into Jorah's hands, as if it were a stone she did not wish to hold longer. He read and frowned and read again, the lines deepening at the corners of his mouth where his beard could not completely disguise the tenderness and obstinacy beneath. Better to choose men whose pride you understand, he said at last. The Unsullied are a tool too sharp for their owners. They have only one edge. If it breaks, there is nothing left. Arstan's eyes went to the dragons and returned. The way a man turns his head to check a wound he has learned to live with. The Red City produces wonders that are crimes. He said softly. Purchasing them must be done with the care one gives to poison, if one is to purchase them at all. Strong Belwas slapped his belly and belched. Strong Belwas does not fear any Unsullied, he said cheerfully. They are small men with sticks. Strong Belwas will eat 5 of them, 1 bite each, and ask for a fig. He grinned to show that war was a kind of dessert to him, and Daenerys loved him for turning the city's terror into a joke and hated the joke for how close it came. She kept the letter by her bed that night. She did not read it. She lay on her side with Drogon's heat pooled against her ribs, and watched the moon cut a path across the ceiling, and asked her heart whether a wrong thing done for a right reason would wear a different face in the morning. When she slept at last, she dreamed of a line of boys with their noses cut so neat, the scars looked like deliberate adornment, and of a grassland whose grass had been combed by the passage of 100,000 feet, moving as one body. In the dream she was both the hand that cut and the hand that lifted the veil, and she woke with her mouth dry and her fingers cold. The factor from Astapor came at dusk as if that would make him gentler. He entered Xaro's great hall walking very straight, his robe a deep wine that flattered the dye quarter and his face powdered a little too thick to hide its scars. He brought 3 men behind him and called them not men, but instruments. They moved with a coiled neatness that would have been beautiful had the beauty not been made in such a manner. He asked Daenerys to order one to cut his own cheek. She did not. She asked him instead to order the men to drink. He hesitated. He had not thought to practice generosity. When he gave the word, the 3 took up cups and drank together, and set the cups down with a sound like tiny bells, because their coordination was so precise. Arstan watched and remembered a different hall, and a boy named for a bird who had been precise in his cruelties. Strong Belwas watched and scratched himself, and wondered whether any of these unsmiling sticks could play at all. When the factor had finished showing her what he wished to sell, and had begun to make the shapes with his mouth that indicated a price was coming, Daenerys lifted her hand. "No," she said, and the word sounded like water falling on something hot. "I will not buy men." The factor's face went very polite. She went on, "But I will hire ships, and I will send them to your city with salt and sugar and steel and honey, and take in exchange 100 boys who will walk out under their own names." The factor did not move for a moment. "You speak of theft," he said, exquisitely calm. "I speak of ransom," Daenerys said, "for those who have been stolen already." The factor inclined his head as one might do to humor a child's gift. He took his leave smoothly, the little dance of wrists and fingers performed so perfectly that one wished to clap. She did not look at him as he went. She looked at the 3 instruments behind him, and they stood very still, and their eyes did not move. When the factor had passed from the hall, she said, as if to the floor, "You three, what are your names?" They told her. Their voices were even, and their names had the smell of other men who had warned them first. But they were names, and when they had said them, Drogon's tail thumped once against her calf, and she felt in that thump a kind of recognition. The warlocks marked that evening with a wind that came indoors. Candles tilted and remained burning though the flame lay horizontal. The curtains breathed toward the floor. A wetness ran stubbornly up the walls and dried just as stubbornly in the pattern of a man's face, which Eerie crossed herself to see and would not cross again. The dragons hissed and went very bright in the eyes. Daenerys stood until the wind had run out of the room like a cat chased from a table, and told no one to bar any door. If the House of the Undying wished to drive its weather through the city, she would not give it the dignity of frightened furniture. A night later, Strong Belwas was attacked in a mango grove behind the kitchens, where the cooks went to do their swearing and their weeping. 3 men with blue tongues and blades black to a velvet sheen fell on him as he sat with a plucked chicken and a handful of salt. He broke the wrist of the first and the arm of the second, and bit the ear of the third off as if it were a fig. Jogo ran in, laughing with delight at an honest fight breaking out in a tender place, and cracked one blue-lipped skull with the butt of his arak, because he had taken a vow not to marry until he had cracked 100 and the warlocks would not count. Arstan came with his staff, and turned a knife with the ease of a man who had stopped counting his days in armor, not because they bored him, but because he had decided to know their number precisely. They took one of the warlocks alive, which surprised them, and more than surprised the warlock, who had believed that the city itself would swallow him back. They bound his hands in silk, because silk disgraced a man who had pretended to be a god. They brought him to Daenerys, and she looked upon his blue tongue, and his fine hands and his wrists, which showed where the dye had bled, and where it had not, and said, "I will not harm you. I will harm where you live." The next morning she walked to the House of the Undying. She took with her Jorah and Arstan and Strong Belwas, and 12 of her Dothraki with their hair bound tight for battle, and 8 Qartheen who had forgotten how to be afraid of the men their city had taught them to fear. She wore a robe the color of a cloud before it learns to rain. The house stood where it had always stood, which is to say it seemed to have chosen to stand there each time you looked at it. The vines that covered it were thick and gray-green and smelled of memory. Their leaves were like little hands laid on your face to cover your eyes. The door was no door or many doors, depending on whether a man wanted to turn the handle. Quaithe was waiting in the street, which was unkind of her. "Do not go in," she said gently. "I will not," Daenerys said. "I have already gone in, and am not so foolish a queen that I must repeat what I have done badly, in order to prove that I can do it better." She looked at the vines and felt, beneath their leaf-silent argument, the weight of 1,000 hungers focused at the center of the house, like mouths under cloth. "I will burn down what can be burned, and starve what cannot." She gave the order, and men ran, and brought baskets of pitch and kindling, and the small charcoal that Qarth uses to perfume rooms. They built fires along the house's base, as if laying a necklace about a throat. The vines hissed when the pitch touched them, as if the house itself were sucking its teeth. Smoke wove upward, and a few of the leaves blackened and folded into the shape that all leaves take at the last. Jorah stood with his arms folded and his jaw set. Arstan leaned on his staff and watched with the unwilling patience of a man attending a ceremony whose sense he could not deny and did not enjoy. Strong Belwas danced a little for the delight of the children who had gathered, stamping his feet in the sticky pitch with a glee that promised the laundresses new curses to practice. The house breathed the smoke in. The vines drank. The flames did less than they should have done. Daenerys watched until her skin smelled of ash, and then gave another order. Oil on the roots, not the leaves. Strong Belwas dug his hands under the vine's grip and peeled back what lay under, and made a sound like disgust at a stew that had been left too long. The oil ran into the earth and slicked the house as if its blood had been brought to the surface. When the torches touched it, then the fire learned its work. The House of the Undying burned without screaming. That was the indecency of it. It seemed to take pleasure in the evenness of its disassembly. The smoke lifted pale and made a coil like a woman's hair being arranged. The children scuffled to be nearer and then drew back without being told. A wind came very softly from the sea and spread the smell through the street like spice. Daenerys stood until the roof fell in and the vines curled to nothing at her feet. Then she turned her head and saw Qarth, who had not moved, and wondered at a woman who could watch a piece of her city die and not flinch. Or perhaps the Shadowbinder was flinching so slowly it would take a month to see it. By evening the 13 made their speeches. One must always let men perform a little before they can be made to act. Xaro Zod-Sahan of the Silk Islands declared that the city must protect its secrets, else it was no longer itself. Malako of the Spicers wept saffron tears for a house that had given his childhood a particular thrill of fear. Xaro, in a robe that expressed a grief more expensive than most weddings, declared that it was a pity fire sometimes came where one had not ordered. The pureborn said nothing at all and made that their speech. Daenerys accepted their scoldings with courtesy, as if they were rain she had been expecting, and then asked the city for what she had already taken. Work parties went out at dawn to pull down the charred roots and clear the stones lest the warlocks creep back along any bit of vine left like a rope. She ordered a festival of clean water run down the gutters from the palace cisterns into certain alleys where the poorest lived, and sent boys with ladles and salted bread so everyone would remember to drink slowly. The Qartheen love a spectacle that tastes of mercy while preserving the excellence of their appetite. She learned to feed that appetite without letting it feed on her. Xaro came to her that night with a face that said he had been the city, and now he wished to be only himself. He walked with the careful slowness of a man stepping around shards only he could see. "You have made enemies," he said, not as a reproach, but as if announcing the purchase price of a splendid carpet. "I have always had enemies," she said. Drogon lifted his head and spread his wings in the candlelight, as if to underline the simplicity of the statement. "Ah, but these are enemies with the unusual patience of dead men," he said. "The living tire, the dead do not. The warlocks will have friends you did not know you had." "Menstand. Then I will grow tired more slowly," she said. And he laughed with genuine pleasure, that bright boy's laugh of his that always made her remember that he had once been no more than a handsome child running beside a river. Arstan watched her in those days, with the quiet of a man who has decided upon his moment. He had been patient with his name, wearing it lightly as if it might slip, and patient with her temper, which had learned to hold itself like a lantern rather than a sword. He surprised her in the palace forecourt as she stood with Eerie arguing about whether the pears were in or out of season according to a calendar neither trusted. "I knew your father," he said very softly, and it was as if he had reached out and touched her face. She turned and the air between them had the fragile stillness of snow. "You told me you knew something of kings," she said. "I did." He straightened, and she glimpsed the ghost of another stance from another life. "I am Barristan Selmy," called the bold, "Knight of the Kingsguard, and once Lord Commander, and I come with my head bowed to you, because I failed your house when it needed me most." The courtyard made itself very discreet. Even the wind held its breath. Ser Jorah came in with the force of a man who has recognized the sound of a kind of doom. He took a step and stopped, as if he had found a pit where he had expected a stair. Arstan, Barristan, lowered himself to one knee on stone and gave her his name again, not as a revelation, but as a pledge. He told her how he had served her father and then had served the usurper, because he had believed his calling lay with the throne and not with the man. He told her how he had been dismissed with scorn from a council table and had gone east to find the Targaryen queen whose blood had been treated like dirt, and how he had walked, old and obstinate, after rumors until one day the rumors took her hand. He told her also, and this was the stone he knew he must put on his own foot, that there had been a time when letters had gone from Jorah Mormont to men in King's Landing. Letters that made of her a small coin passed from hand to hand. Years gone now, but not undone. Jorah's face had gone pale under his beard. He looked at her with the look of a man hanging from a cliff by his hands, who has been asked whether he would prefer to let go or climb. "It was before," he said. "Before I knew you. Before I knew anything." His voice cracked and steadied, that old soldier's grace. "And I told them nothing in Qarth. I would not have, I did not. Daenerys felt a dozen emotions rise together like birds startled from a tree. She did not know which to follow, so she did not follow any. She looked at Barristan, and at Jorah, and at the space between them that had been quietly waiting for this day. She thought of the little kindnesses in Jorah, the way he angled his body to give her shade, the way he made jokes when she was too proud to laugh at her own seriousness, and of the letters that had gone from his hand to men who would have weighed her on a scale and smiled at the number. She thought of Barristan's name, and of what it meant to the boy she had loved without meeting, Rhaegar, and to a father she had never judged because she did not know how to weigh madness that had long since spent itself like a storm. "You will both remain," she said at last, and heard Jorah's breath leave him and Barristan's breath come until the two inhalations sounded like a single thing. "You will both serve me. You will both say to me now, and favor truth over pride and counsel over flattery, and none shall keep from me any part of my life that belongs to me. And you, Sir Jorah, will not speak to the Lysing tavern keeper by the west gate again, nor to any whose arms bear 3 pinpricks tattooed in a triangle, nor to the little man with blackened fingers who salts the fish at the South Quay and asks questions as if he were a poem." Then, though a muscle twitched in Jorah's cheek, "I have not spoken to them," he said. "You would have," she said. And in the saying of it, she forgave him enough to go on, which was not the same as forgiving all. "You will sleep now not in the room beside mine, but in the room across the courtyard. You will take your meals apart until I call you to my table. You will not touch a letter with another man's seal on it." She looked at Barristan. "And you, who have given me your name twice, will go with strong Belwas tomorrow to call on those in the city whose job it is to keep their hands clean while they wash the dirty hands of others. You will remind them that the work they do is seen." Barristan bowed his head, and she saw relief and sorrow share his face like brothers who had learned to share a cup. Jorah bowed his head lower, and she saw his grief and his stubbornness make a house together, and knew that house would not be blown down by the first wind. The next weeks passed as slowly as an old song lengthened by the singer's love of it. Barristan's presence began to alter the shape of the days without any visible effort. He made the guards in the forecourt stand a little straighter by the simple work of standing straighter himself. He taught 3 of her Dothraki a trick of the knee and wrist that let a man turn a thrust into air, and, in teaching it, learned a word in the Dothraki tongue that turned an insult used among brothers into a joke that carried no sting. Strong Belwas adored him at once and entirely, because the old knight would not take offense when Belwas announced that he would protect him from spoons and stares in equal measure. Jorah tolerated him with the coolness of a man who knows his faults have been described aloud. They rode out together once and came back quiet, which was either a truce or the beginning of a better quarrel. The factor from Astapor sent another letter, then a third, each sweeter than the last, like a candy thickening over a bitter almond. She answered none. She sent instead a ship. Hope or patience, both were out and back so often now that the harbor clerks had begun to speak their names like weather. To the Red City with jars of oil, and a list of the boys whose names she had bought in the market, with her gaze, and in the back lanes with cups of water, and in the cool of the palace, with the purses Zaro liked to pretend he had not noticed missing. The ship did not return with boys. It returned with a neat scroll stating that the price of a boy's name in Astapor was the price of a city's pride times 3. Then they will keep their pride. She said, and fed the scroll to Drogon, and watched the ash fall on the tiles, like a gray lace. Zaro sulked delightfully, and then recovered twice as quickly, and threw a party that lasted 3 nights, the 3rd night devoted entirely to the possibility of moonlight trapped in glass. He sent her a ring of mother of pearl and obsidian that felt like wearing the sea and the night together. She wore it and did not marry him. He took her refusal as a sport, and then, one afternoon when the wind came from the desert and carried the smell of dry leaves and old leather, he took it as an insult. He arrived in a robe the color of a storm that has decided against rain, and spoke very softly of debts the city owed to itself, and debts owed by guests to hosts, and how, in the end, All doors in Qarth might be closed should certain conditions be met. She listened until he had built his neat little house of threats, and then she took one of its bricks away. "Close them," she said. He blinked. "Close the doors. Tell the city that Daenerys Targaryen is to be turned away from any shop or home whose owner's blood runs cool enough to prefer the favor of the 13 to the favor of her dragons. Count each locked hinge. It will be good to know who is brave enough to be my friend." She smiled in the Qarthine way, which is to say she let her eyes show her amusement and did nothing with her lips. "Then watch which doors the wind opens." He looked at her in silence for a long heartbeat, and then he laughed. Sudden and honest. "Oh, my star," he said. "How fortunate we are to live in times when a woman like you chooses our city for her practice." He kissed the air above her hand and his rings flashed like coins falling into water. The warlocks did their work more quietly after the burning. Men began to see blue stains on their fingers and did not know from what cup they had drunk. A slow hushing fell on certain rooms, as if someone had laid down a hand and said to the air, "Remember." Daenerys did not chase this hush. She put a different sound into the city. She ordered musicians to play at the crossings of 4 streets where the bathhouses were cheap. She had arcs of silk hung in alleys so that the wind would make them speak. She paid a pair of old women to tell stories of another time in Qarth when the city had decided whether it wanted to be a marketplace or a kingdom and had failed at both and lived to tell the tale. The city listened to itself telling itself and found it liked that sound better than the one the warlocks made. When the second of her ships returned with a cracked mast and a captain limping and the hold only half full of what it had gone to fetch, she did not curse. She went down to the quay and put her hand on the cracked wood and praised the captain for bringing home what he had saved, rather than weeping for what he had lost. The harbor learned that praise might be had for survival. Men took that lesson to sea. She went with Barristan one morning to the northern gate and watched a caravan come in from the shadow of the Bone Mountains. The first camels wore bells on their collars and the last wore bells on their tails, so that the sound of arriving was both a hello and a goodbye. The cloth was rough and the spices stale, and the men closer to wolves than friends. But in the midst of the dust, a woman came walking with a basin balanced on her head, and in the basin grew 3 little orange trees, no larger than her hand. They were not fruiting, they were striving. Daenerys bought them and had them planted in 3 shallow bowls on her balcony, and the dragon sniffed them and decided to leave them alone. When, weeks later, a single white flower opened on one of the trees like a secret, she stood very still and watched it flicker in the heat and thought of a lemon tree and a house with a red door and felt not sadness, but an ache that had become something she could carry and still think. News filtered across the water like oil. Slow, persistent, staining what it touched. Men spoke of a sickness in the west that turned bowels to water and water to death. Of a horse seen riderless at a city's gate that the gatekeepers named as if it were a man. They spoke of 3 kings and of no king, and of a boy with a hound whose howl was heard at the edge of a battlefield. Arstan gave her maps drawn by hand where the edges of the world had been erased and redrawn until the parchment crackled. Yora gave her a harder thing, the measure of time. When Drogon's wings are as long as a tall man's arm from shoulder to fingertip, he will be able to carry you within a year, he said in a tone that was no tone at all. She looked at her dragon and the bones pushing against his velvet skin and did not reach out her hand to measure. She would not put her need on him like a weight. In the 7th month of her staying there came a turning. It did not announce itself. It arrived like a change of light, making colors she had not noticed before. A fire broke out among the warehouses along the South Quay, and any other day it would have been only a fire. But that day the wind had decided to blow as if from 2 directions at once. The flames licked across 6 roofs and settled on a 7th, and then, perversely, refused to move at all. Men shouted, and ran in, and stood, and stared, and ran out with their hair alight. It was Barristan who saw the net, a lattice of cords of some oily thread strung between 2 beams above the warehouse, where the flames lay as if sleeping. He shouted, and Strong Belwas laughed, and climbed a stack of barrels as if climbing were his longest-held love. He cut the net with a knife too short for the work, and fell into a bale of cinnamon and came up smelling like a pastry. The fire rose at once, deprived of its strange lullaby. The warlocks had tried to teach flame a new habit. The city said no. That evening, she brought the dragons down to the water. The harbor stank of fish and of the particular iron smell that comes when fire has been fought. She stood on the damp boards of a pier and held a piece of raw fish in her fingers, and Drogon came to take it delicately, his teeth touching her skin with a care that felt like pride. A boy on the next pier stared as if his heart had climbed behind his eyes. "Come," she said to him, and he came. She gave him a sliver and told him to hold his hand very steady, and he did, and Rhaegal took it, and the boy did not soil himself, and the world folded around that little victory like a flower. When she returned to the palace, there was a letter waiting, tied with plain string and sealed with wax, stamped only with a simple mark of a circle. The hand that had formed the letters inside was a woman's, fine and a little impatient. The letter told Daenerys that a certain warehouse used by a certain man to store certain cheeses had lately held something other than cheese. The smell of shade of the evening and the blue-dyed linen used to make masks for men with dead affections. It suggested that if a queen wished to make a friend, she might burn the cheese. Daenerys smiled in spite of the city and sent strong Belwas to burn the cheese. It took only a little thinking to identify her anonymous correspondent. A widow who had learned to hear the wind in a voice. A woman who had seen her husband's ship leave and not return and learned in the long afterwards how the harbor talked to itself. Daenerys sent her a purse and a bolt of good linen dyed the deep sea blue Qarth reserves for the proud and the quiet. The woman sent back a single orange, out of season and still warm from the hand that had plucked it. Daenerys cut it with her own knife and ate it standing, and the sugar and acid together made her eyes water. In the second year she had 3 ships that were truly hers and 2 that were half hers by a fiction pleasing to Qarthian accountants. She had a network of water sellers who took her coin and Zaro's coin and the coin of her enemies and kept the city alive because it amused them to be the lungs. She had a guard whose fate. She had her dragons, who had learned to roast a goat without turning the meat black, and to hunt seabirds in a wind, and to listen to her when the blood went up and her voice went down. She had not bought a single man in Astapor. She went sometimes to the roof of the palace at night and lay with her back on the warm stone and looked up until the stars moved. They moved, of course, because she did. That was the comfort and the horror of it. Once, in such a night, she dreamed she was in a long, narrow boat with no oars, moving along a black water under a black sky. The only light, a small, steady lamp, set in the bow. On either side, men and women walked in the water and did not splash, and their mouths moved and made no sound. And she knew that if she leaned out a little, she could hear them clearly. But if she leaned out a little, her fingers would touch the black, and the lamp would blow. She woke with her hands clenched, and Drogon's head heavy on her shoulder, and the taste of iron in her mouth. She went to the balcony and breathed, and Qarth was there, or the idea of her was there, and the mask in her hands looked like the moon. "You are steering," the Shadowbinder said, and Daenerys laughed softly in the night and said, "I am lying on my back on a roof," and Qarth said, "As you choose," and was not there. The third year brought visitors from the Jade Sea who wore cinnamon bark like belts and told stories in a sing-song that made the poorest Qartheen feel rich. It brought a summer that Tyre marked the city with a heat so bland the spices seemed bored. It brought a child born in the palace kitchens with a call on her face and the look in her eyes of someone older than the city and younger than a dragon. It brought also a new enemy, an enemy that was not blue-lipped or masked or old but ordinary. Men who had grown used to the way the city had reshaped itself around the queen with the dragons and decided, as men do, that they had been both wronged and brave in permitting it. They gathered in the Hall of 1,000 Thrones with a formality so perfect that for a time the form itself might have been mistaken for agreement. The 13 spoke of tariffs and the proper respect due to men who had built the city from silk and sand. The ancient guild of spicers spoke of measures and weights and proposed a law that would regulate the size of dragon droppings in public places and levy a fine payable in cinnamon. The pureborn spoke of purity and the right of ancient stones to be admired without the distraction of new stories written across them. Daenerys listened until listening felt like a skill she could practice with her eyes closed, and then she stood and did not speak. She walked out into the square and the people followed, a sound like a long cloth being shaken. And she climbed the steps and stood where the warlocks had sent her the boy with the bowl, and she lifted her hand and made no speech at all. Her dragons dropped from the sky like answers. They came to rest on the steps one by one, folding themselves into the bodies they had until their bodies remembered fire. Drogon opened his mouth a little, and the smell that came was not the smell of the house of the undying, nor the smell of incense or cinnamon, or those sweet meats the Qartheen fry in oil so hot it threatens lewdness. It was the clean animal smell of a creature living as it was meant to live. The square quieted without being asked. A woman in a borrowed gown put her hand to her breast as if to keep a thought in. A boy laughed and then caught the laugh and held it. "Look," Daenerys said at last, and the word went out like a small coin thrown into a fountain. "You have made a city that outlasts the men who built it. You have built yourselves into the walls and into the songs your daughters teach their daughters. I will leave you something when I go. But not yet." She lifted a hand, and Drogon's head came up and his neck arched. And she felt for a moment that strange doubleness that sometimes took her. As if she were standing in her own body and also very far above it, looking down as a hawk looks down on a field where a hare may be. "Not yet," she said again, because the city loved to be told twice what it should already know. Afterward, in the quiet behind the walls, where the vines pretended not to listen, Barristan told her that when a king loses the love of a city, the loss announces itself with the stealthiness of dawn, and not the suddenness of a thunderclap. "Be wary of the day when men stop telling you their little quarrels," he said. "Tyrants and saints are both introduced by silence." "I am neither," she said. And he bowed as if she could be whatever she chose. In the bow was the faith that made him dangerous, the faith men lost when they were young and gained again when their hair went white. She went to the north wall that evening and sat with her feet swinging as if she were a girl again, and watched the caravans come in with their bells at neck and tail. A man walked past with a cage of small gray birds and called them luck. He told the buyers not to open the cage. She bought them and opened the cage, and the birds went out into the city and discovered the sky, and came back to the cage and sat on it. "So," she said aloud, not without bitterness, and stroked Drogon's neck until the bitterness grew smaller than the curve of a scale. On a day when the sea looked very high, though it lay where it always lay, a gray ship came into the harbor and moored at a place where the water layered its light like mica. Its figurehead was a woman with her mouth open, which the harbor took as a bad joke. The man who came down the gangplank wore a cloak cut to resemble feathers, and carried a staff not because he needed it, but because he had learned that men keep their distance from a man with a stick. He introduced himself as a priest of a god who was old in the east and would be old in the west, and had a fire he wished to show her. She did not let him aboard her balcony. She made him build his brazier in the forecourt, under strong belwas, amused supervision, and listened while he spoke of light and darkness, and of another young queen, with dragon blood, whom his god had once liked and then forgotten. She told him she had her own gods, and that her dragons were not subjects to be converted. He smiled and said something graceful and left. And in the night she dreamed of a red woman whose mouth had been a blade, and of a boy made of shadows whose death had not kept him from growing. In the morning she sent a coin to the priest and a pot of lentils to his crew. The coin was stamped with her face, and the lentils were very good. The priest read the coin and ate the lentils, and decided his god might not need to enjoy this city more than once. When the drought came, it came as a change in the wind that did not turn. The cisterns drew down toward their carved lines. The boys who sold ice panicked, and the men who sold it did not. She ordered the upper pools emptied into the lower ones, and sent a parade of jars through the poorest lanes escorted by musicians who made the water a celebration. She fined a man whose whetstone dripped extravagantly. She praised by name the woman who shared the last of her bucket with a stranger, and had Eri carry to her a small jar of honey and a ribbon of deep blue for her hair. Zaro called on her wearing a robe the color of hoarded money and suggested very gently that she dispatch her dragons for a time to an island he had leased, where there was a spring and no children to be burned by accident. She thanked him and declined. That night she sat with Drogon on the highest parapet and made him fly only at her word, and found, to her relief, that he obeyed. She did not believe her dragons could be made to sin by another man's will, but she had learned to treat fear with a formal courtesy, bow to it, and send it away unneeded. When the rain came at last, it came in a rush, as it always does in cities that have put on drought like a festival mask. The gutters filled and sang. The silk hung in the alleys took on the color of storm. Men shouted jokes about drowning, and women spread blankets on the tiles to catch what heaven threw down. Daenerys stood in the courtyard and let herself be soaked. Drogon hated it and loved it, and tried to fly in it, and failed and shouted with glee at the failure. She laughed and felt herself washed clean of certain moods that had been clinging to her like fine dust. In that clean hour Qarth came once more. She stood under the eaves as if the rain were a thing to be negotiated with, her mask on and her hands free. "You are not the only one who has learned patience," she said. The mask turned a little, as if to look at the lines of water running down the palace walls, and read them. "There are men who have made of waiting an art. Do not let their quiet persuade you that stillness is the only wisdom." Daenerys tipped her face up to the rain and let the drops hit her eyelids until she had to close them, and her sight was altered by water and light and the shadow of the woman at the eaves. "I know," she said. "I have stood too still sometimes, thinking it was a way of walking." She opened her eyes. "But not forever. You carry many futures," said Qarth, as if this were an affront she was willing to forgive. To hold so many is already a kind of action. After the rain, the city smelled of fruit and brick, and a little like regret. In that dear air she counted her ships, and found herself at 7, 2 more than she had allowed her heart to hope for in a private hour, on a warm stone roof. She counted her stores. Salt, grain, oil, good bronze, better iron, coin of 5 cities, and her own stamped circles, whose weight men trusted now, even if they did not all love the face upon them. She counted her friends and her enemies, and found that there were men who stood on one list in the morning and the other by supper, and she was no longer surprised. She counted her dragons and found that there were 3. She dreamed once more of flight, not the old girl's dream of oil-black wings cutting the sun apart, but a slow high circling over a plain of red and green, and a river that made ascribed sensual curves, and the sound of 100,000 men trying not to be afraid and failing beautifully. She woke with her hand gripping the edge of the bed and Drogon's head heavy on her breast, and said aloud, "Not yet," and the word felt less like a denial and more like a line drawn neatly between 2 places, a line she would cross when she chose. On the morning the swallows came back to the canals and stitched the air above the water with thread you could not see. She climbed the middle wall with Barristan, and strong Belwas and Jorah, and no guard at all, because she wished once more to be only a woman on a wall. The city below moved in its ordinary genius. Men haggled, women carried, children calculated futures in the way they used a broom to draw a square on a stone. The harbor flashed and thought of storms and of the strange fires that sometimes came and made men think of gods until the gods bored them again. Beyond the farthest gate, the scrub went away into a brown that would never be green, and then into a blue that might be water or might be a trick of the eye. Drogon landed on the parapet beside her, and the stone took his weight and seemed pleased with it. "Soon," she said to him, and to the men beside her, and to the city, and to the sea, and to the little trees on her balcony that had learned to live in bowls. "Very soon." No one answered. The wind came and took the word and went on. Barristan's hand closed briefly, without thinking, around the parapet's edge in a gesture that belonged to another city and long ago. He released it and his hand lay open, and she loved him for that small, hard practice. Jorah looked at her and looked away without bitterness, which was a kind of bravery she respected more than the other kind. Strong Belwas belched like a gong and startled 3 swallows. and they left and came back and resumed their stitches as if no noise had ever been made. She went down into the city then, for the ordinary work. Petitions and levers and the placement of jars and the naming of grievances and the tying up of those small parcels of hunger that men call business, carrying in her the steady weight of a decision that had not yet taken its last shape. Her dragons followed, one on the left, one on the right, one ahead, as if sent to warn the air that a different kind of weather was coming. In the great hall where the floor was a map, she paused and put her bare foot on the place where the water widened, and the land gathered itself for a crossing, and no one looking saw more than a girl stand a moment and think. That night she ate with the sailors, and not in the long lamp-hung hall. They told her of places she would know soon. The yellow river whose banks are always being eaten. The town where goats have learned to climb. The string of islets where the water is sweet at low tide and bitter at high. She listened until their words made her mouth taste of salt. She slept afterward on a low couch, with the sound of men snoring all around, and Drogon ran the length of the ceiling in his dreams, and woke with a sullen chirr that made Eerie laugh and Jiqui warn, and both then blush, because they had lived long enough with a queen to be embarrassed by having bodies that did what bodies do. At dawn she put on a robe she could move in, and ate with her fingers a bread baked in the clay oven that had arrived in her ship's hold like a promise kept too late. She went to the balcony, and the 3 small orange trees were lifting their leaves into a light that was not yet heat. She touched one leaf. It tasted faintly of her own oil. She called for parchment and a scribe. She made a list that had on it 7 ships and a number of men, equal to the number of masts, multiplied by the number of debts she intended to pay, and a number of women equal to the number of jars of water she would not have others carry for her. It had the number 3 on it in the shape of a dragon. It had also the line that she wrote near the bottom with a hand that did not shake: West. When she had finished, she folded the list once only, and sealed it with her own seal, and sent it down to the harbor where the men who made ships speak, agreed sometimes to listen. She did not call her court. She did not summon Zaro. She walked into the courtyard and told Barristan and strong Belwas and Jorah and Jogo to bring what they wished to carry on their backs, and told Eerie and Jiqui to roll the rugs and pack the jars of oil and milk, and tie the silk so the wind would have to work to get in. She told them nothing else. She did not say, "We are leaving." She did not say, "We are going now." The city would hear her footsteps and know, as all cities do, when a heart had lifted itself to move. It would try to remind her of the sweetness it had taught her, and the debts she had willingly incurred, and the ways it had tried to save her from her own edge. It would fail, and it would forgive her. Before noon she went once more up the stair that was not a stair, and stood on the highest parapet where a woman might stand and still be believed to be careful. Drogon came to her shoulder, and the weight of him made that shoulder ache. Pleasant as old work, she put a hand to his chest and felt the furnace in him, banked and ready. Not yet. She had told the wind 100 times and been obeyed. She did not say, "Not yet now." She said nothing. And in that silence her choice took on the hardness of a thing that had been forged and quenched and would ring when struck. The swallows moved like thought across the canal. A bell rang in the die quarter, and men came out with hands the color of boasts. The harbor creaked and shifted, and then laid itself at rest as a big animal does before it rises. The palace shook out its silk. The city gathered itself to be missed. Daenerys Targaryen breathed in the smell of spice and fish and old stone and new water, and breathed out a line so thin no one would have thought to listen for it, and all the same men heard it, and did not know what they had heard. She turned from the wall, and the dragons went with her, and the day bent itself around her in that small way days have of bending, when they know someone has already begun to remake them.